They say anniversaries are for love, memories, and grand gestures. Mine. It ended with my husband raising a glass before 80 of the city's most powerful guests and declaring he'd been disgusted by me since our wedding night. They thought I'd break. Instead, I smiled, because he had no idea I'd been waiting for this moment, and no clue what I had planned for him next. My name is Isabel Dawson, and that night, our 10th wedding anniversary, I wore the smile of a woman who'd just been publicly humiliated by her own husband, and didn't flinch. The ballroom at the Crown Atherton gleamed beneath a ceiling of gold leaf chandeliers. 80 of New York's most influential bankers, investors, and socialites sipped Dom Perignon from crystal flutes while the string quartet played a soft, predictable waltz. White orchids cascaded from marble columns. The menu featured oysters, truffle risotto, and a $600 vintage Bordeaux selected by my husband himself. Everything was perfect. At least, that's how it looked. Charles Dawson, hedge fund star, board member of Dawson Investments, and master of facades, tapped his champagne glass lightly. The hall hushed. My parents, seated beside us, turned their faces toward him. I could feel the weight of 100 expectant eyes following his every move. To love, to family, to 10 incredible years, Charles began, flashing his polished, camera-ready grin. There it was, the performance. He stood tall in his midnight blue tuxedo, silver cufflinks glinting under the lights. His arm brushed against mine, casual, possessive, rehearsed. Every detail of this evening had been curated for maximum social currency. And I'd played my part, the perfect wife, the charming hostess, the supportive mother of his child. Then he looked at me. The smile sharpened. But tonight, Charles said, letting his voice drop to a theatrical hush, I think it's time I was honest. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. Someone whispered behind me, "He's going to make her cry." I knew exactly what he was going to do. Charles leaned forward slightly, his voice cold as marble. "Isabel, I've been disgusted by you since our first night together." A glass slipped from someone's hand, shattering softly against the marble floor. A sharp gasp cut through the music. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Someone near the back let out a nervous, disbelieving laugh. Charles lifted his glass higher. 10 years I've tolerated your cold, hollow charade, played the loving husband, but I'm done pretending. And the room fell silent. I could feel the stares drilling into me, waiting for me to break. For a sob. A scene. A collapse. Instead, I smiled. I stood, carefully smoothing the folds of my champagne-colored gown. The air buzzed with an electric tension as I turned, not to Charles, but to the AV technician stationed near the stage. I gave him the smallest nod. The lights dimmed. The quartet's last notes hung in the air before dissolving into an eerie hush. Behind the velvet-draped bandstand, the massive projection screen flickered to life. "What the hell is this?" Charles muttered beside me, his hand clenched around his glass. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The screen faded to black. A single gold-embossed title card appeared in elegant serif letters. 10 years of happiness. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A soft piano melody began, the song we danced to at our wedding. The first video frame, me, in my wedding dress, twirling in slow motion, smiling at a man I thought I loved, with Charles staring back, his expression unreadable. A few people chuckled nervously. "Is this their wedding video?" Someone whispered. I didn't move. I didn't blink. And Charles went pale. "Isabel, what is this?" His voice cracked slightly. Still, I said nothing. The next scene rolled, our first anniversary. A perfect family photo, followed by a close-up of Charles on a business trip, laughing over a glass of scotch, with his assistant, Sophie Caldwell, perched beside him. The timestamp on the corner, just 4 nights ago? The crowd gasped in unison. I watched Charles's jaw tighten, his composure unraveling by the second. He reached out as if to stop the video, but of course, the remote wasn't in his hand tonight. The screen faded again, and the real story was just beginning. 3 days before the anniversary, I woke up with a pounding migraine. It was nothing unusual. I'd been juggling event planners, floral designers, and Charles's endless last-minute requests for weeks. That morning, I barely managed to sip my coffee in the kitchen before telling Charles I wasn't feeling well. He didn't look up from his phone. "Go lie down," he mumbled, scrolling through what I assumed was a client brief. I went upstairs, but I didn't sleep. By noon, the house felt unnervingly quiet. No calls, no staff, no footsteps echoing from Charles's office. I kicked off my heels and headed straight to our bedroom, ready to curl into bed and nurse my headache in silence. That's when I saw it. Charles's phone, lying on the nightstand, unlocked. Face up. I froze. Charles never left his phone unattended. Ever. It was practically an extension of his hand. He'd once taken it with him into the sauna at the club. I stared at it, heart thudding. Curiosity? Maybe. Instinct? Definitely. I picked it up. The screen blinked on instantly. One text preview flashed at the top. "Can't wait to try the new set on for you. Red is your favorite. Right?" Sender. Sophie. I felt something coil tighten my chest. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. The hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the room. Then, hands steadier than I expected, I swiped it open. His passcode? Our daughter's birthday? Of course. He never thought he'd need to change it. The message thread opened like a trapdoor beneath my feet. Photos, videos, voice notes, dozens of messages from Sophie Caldwell, Charles's assistant. "I hate pretending you're just my boss. I can't stand seeing you go home to her." And Charles's replies? "Just 3 more days. Let her have her little anniversary. After that, I'm done playing house." But the worst? "Don't worry about the prenup. My attorney says if I wait until after the anniversary, I'll walk with half of my name, half of my family's legacy, half of the life I'd built, for him." I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the phone like it was a live grenade. The photos. Sophie wrapped in a robe, my robe. Charles's hand on her waist in an office I recognized too well. Dinner at the Four Seasons, a hotel suite in the city. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt something inside me shift. Like a door slamming shut in a house I hadn't realized was full of strangers. By sunset, I was sitting across from a man I hadn't seen in almost a decade, Jonathan Price. A former federal investigator turned private security consultant, the man who once helped my father root out a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme from inside Dawson Investments. We met at a quiet cafe in Midtown. I told him everything, slowly, clearly, like I was reciting a business report, not the collapse of my marriage. He listened, didn't interrupt, just nodded now and then, jotting down the occasional note in a leather-bound book. When I finished, he leaned back. "What do you want exactly?" I met his eyes. "I want evidence. I want names, dates, phone records, photos. I want every lie Charles has told, every deal he's made, every step he's taken to dismantle my life." He tapped his pen on the table. "That'll cost you." I smiled, the first real smile I'd managed all day. "Money isn't the problem," I said. "Exposure is." Jonathan's brow lifted. "And your end goal?" I stirred my untouched coffee once, twice, then met his gaze without blinking. A celebration he'll never forget. It took Jonathan less than 72 hours. The file he delivered came in a sleek, black leather folio. No digital copies, no email trail. He knew what he was doing. I opened it alone in my study. The first page? A photo of Charles, 10 years younger, standing outside a rundown tech startup in Brooklyn. Foreclosure notice pinned to the door. The next page? A timeline. His company had collapsed just 3 months before our wedding. 2 weeks later, he started dating me. My stomach twisted as I flipped through the rest. Phone records, bank transfers, old social media posts. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't even just greed. It was a strategy. A calculated, premeditated conquest. He hadn't fallen for me. He'd hunted me. And I'd married my hunter. But the game was about to change. Because this time, I was holding the rifle. The night I closed that leather folio, I felt colder than I'd ever been. Not because of heartbreak. That would have been too easy. Because of clarity. Charles hadn't just betrayed me with Sophie. He hadn't just lied, cheated, or schemed. He had dissected my life, studied it like a predator stalking its prey. Every conversation, every gesture, every promise. A move on a chessboard I hadn't known I was playing. But the difference between a hunter and his prey? The prey never lets him see her coming. The next morning, I called Jonathan again. "I need one more favor," I said. He sounded almost amused. "Another background check?" "No," I replied calmly. "I want you to help me film something." There was a pause on the line. "What kind of something?" I turned to the window, watching the Manhattan skyline blur under a curtain of rain. "A wedding video," I said softly. "Only this time, it won't be a lie." By noon, we had a plan. I knew Charles better than he knew himself. I knew how easily his vanity could be manipulated. All I had to do was suggest an idea that would stroke his ego and invite him to step right into my trap. That evening at dinner, I leaned across the table, touching his sleeve lightly. "I've been thinking," I said sweetly. "For our anniversary, what if we filmed something for Emily? A video she can watch when she's older. Us talking about our love story, about family, about everything we've built together." Charles set down his wine glass. His lips curved into that smug, camera-ready smile. "A legacy piece?" he asked. "Exactly," I whispered. He bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. By the next morning, I had a production team in place. Not some glossy wedding videographers. Jonathan's contacts, courtroom surveillance experts with experience recording corporate depositions. Professionals who knew how to capture every word, every expression, every slip. Charles didn't notice the quality of the equipment. He didn't question the subtle microphone placement. He didn't even blink when I suggested Sophie join us for a few behind-the-scenes shots at the office. He thought it was all for show, part of the image he adored crafting. And he never noticed that Emily was gone. I had already moved her to my mother's estate in Vermont, safe, loved, and far from the wreckage I was about to create. Over the next 3 days, we filmed everything. Charles pontificating about marriage, about loyalty, about business, about legacy. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. Led him into conversations I knew would trap him in his own arrogance. All with a soft smile. All under the guise of a doting wife preserving memories. By the time the final footage was locked, I had everything I needed. More than enough for the world to see who Charles Dawson really was. The morning of the anniversary, I stood before the gilded mirror in my dressing room at the Crown Atherton. I practiced my smile. Not the polite smile I'd worn at charity luncheons. Not the warm smile I'd given Emily at bedtime. This was different. This was the smile of a woman who had finally learned that patience wasn't weakness. It was power. The smile of a woman who had stopped apologizing for being too trusting. And the smile of a woman about to rewrite her story with a single, devastating truth. The stylist fussed over the hem of my gown. "You look radiant tonight, Mrs. Dawson," she said. I nodded, eyes fixed on my reflection. Downstairs, the ballroom shimmered, golden name cards, white peonies, an ice sculpture carved with the Dawson crest. Everything Charles had wanted, everything he believed was still his. I slipped on my heels, squared my shoulders, and walked out. He was waiting at the head of the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in one hand, and Sophie on his arm. Of course, he brought her. I had insisted. "She's part of your team," I'd said sweetly. It's only fair. Sophie wore a red satin dress, cut far too tight for the occasion. She clung to Charles like a prize he'd won. They looked rehearsed, like betrayal was their stage act. I greeted them with the poise of a perfect hostess. "You made it," I said warmly. Sophie blinked. Charles narrowed his eyes. "You look different," he said slowly. "Lighter," I replied with a soft shrug. "Must be the lighting." And as we made our way to the head table, I knew. Tonight, the spotlight wasn't his. Tonight, the stage was mine. When the first toast ended and the guests' polite applause faded, Charles took his place at the center of the ballroom. He basked in the attention, the soft murmur of admiration rippling through the room. This was his element, performing, deceiving, shining under a spotlight he believed no one could steal. I stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the back of a Louis XVI chair. I knew the toast he was about to give by heart. I'd heard him rehearse it 3 times in front of the mirror that morning, but he didn't get a chance to finish it. As the quartet played the opening bars of a familiar waltz, the lights dimmed. A hushed confusion swept across the room. I tilted my head slightly toward the AV technician at the far end of the hall, Jonathan's man, and gave a simple nod. The screen at the back of the stage flickered to life. Charles's voice caught. "What the hell is this?" he whispered under his breath. The screen faded from white to black, then glowed with elegant golden letters. 10 years of happiness. A soft piano melody began, the same song we'd danced to at our wedding reception. The first image rolled, me, in my wedding gown, spinning slowly on the marble floor of the Dawson estate, my smile wide, genuine, untouched by the truth I would one day discover. And beside me, Charles, staring not at me, but past me, into the crowd, his expression unreadable. The ballroom fell into a strange, breathless silence. A few people chuckled softly. Someone whispered, "Is this their anniversary montage?" Charles shifted beside me. His fingers tightened around his glass. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the screen. The images shifted. Our engagement party, gala dinners, photos of us in the Hamptons, each one carefully chosen to look perfect on the surface. But then, the cracks appeared. A video clip rolled, time-stamped 8 years ago. Charles, sitting in a cheap office, talking to a man off-camera. He laughed, swirling a glass of whiskey. "Of course I married her. You think I'd pass up a Dawson?" A ripple of shocked gasps filled the ballroom. "Her family's a dynasty. She's sweet, predictable, the kind of woman who signs whatever you put in front of her." My mother paled. My father's former business partners exchanged stunned glances. Charles spun toward me, his voice a harsh whisper. "Isabel, turn it off." I didn't move. The video continued, snapshots from surveillance cameras, Charles at a luxury hotel bar, with Sophie, his hand on her knee, a kiss in a hallway, a timestamp from 3 days ago, the day he'd claimed he was in Washington for meetings. The audience watched in horrified fascination, unable to look away. Charles reached out, eyes wild, searching for the remote. It wasn't there. I had it. The screen faded again, but this time, the new clip was darker. A recording of Charles's voice on a phone call, captured by Jonathan's team. "No, she won't see it coming. Once the paperwork's filed, I'll freeze the accounts. She's too busy playing mommy to notice." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. I turned toward him then, slowly. "You said you married me for legacy," I said, my voice low but steady. "But what you never understood was that my legacy doesn't come from a name." I reached into my clutch and drew out a single ivory envelope, embossed with my family's crest. I handed it to him. "Your access is gone," I continued. "The apartment, the accounts, the company. The board has seen the footage." He stared down at the envelope as though it might explode. "You can't do this," he breathed. "You need me." I leaned in slightly, my voice a whisper only he could hear. "I was too soft once. But softness isn't weakness. It's restraint. I straightened, turning back to face the room as the final clip played. Emily, sitting on her bed, hugging her stuffed rabbit. Mommy, why is Daddy never home? The ballroom was silent. I raised my glass to truth, and I drank. Charles sank into his chair, his eyes darting desperately around the room. Not a single person met his gaze, not even Sophie. Especially not Sophie, who had already started backing toward the exit, her face ashen, her hands trembling. And in that perfect, terrible silence, I smiled. The ballroom remained frozen in that charged silence, the kind that hums louder than any applause. Then a voice rang out from the far side of the room. I wasn't planning to speak tonight. Heads turned. Even I blinked in surprise. Edward Ramsey, chairman of Dawson Investments, my father's closest confidant. A man who hadn't been seen at a Dawson family event since my father's funeral 3 years prior. He stood by the entrance, tall, composed, holding a slim leather folio stamped with the Dawson crest. His presence alone made half the guests straighten in their seats. Edward walked forward, his polished shoes tapping softly against the marble, stopping just beside our table. But after everything we've just witnessed, he said, voice calm but sharp as glass, it seems only fitting we finish what Isabel started. Charles flinched like he'd been struck. Edward opened the folio with deliberate care. You didn't just lie to your wife, Charles. Edward continued, flipping through the documents. You lied to this company, to its board, and to every investor who ever trusted you. A low murmur rippled across the guests. Charles stood abruptly, color draining from his face. You can't accuse me of... You're not just being accused. Edward's voice cut clean through the air. You're being removed. Gasps erupted from the tables. Someone dropped a fork. Charles's eyes darted around the room, wild, desperate. Edward turned to me then, his gaze steady, a quiet steel beneath it. Your father always said you had both heart and spine. Edward said softly. Tonight, you proved him right. He placed the folio in front of me. These are executive control documents. Your name is on them now. I took the pen Edward offered and signed with a single, fluid motion. No trembling, no hesitation. The chatter around us swelled into whispers, a collective realization sweeping through the room. I looked at Charles. We're done here. He opened his mouth, but before any sound could escape, the side doors of the ballroom opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, then another 2. The crowd parted around them like water. One officer, tall, no nonsense, addressed him. Charles Dawson, we need you to come with us. Charles let out a sharp, bitter laugh. For what? A bad marriage? The officer didn't flinch. Fraud, insider trading, embezzlement. The words echoed through the grand hall. Within seconds, the cuffs were on his wrists. A stunned silence fell over the guests as the reality of it settled in. Sophie gasped, staggering back. Wait, this isn't... I didn't... No one was listening. The officers led Charles away. His head bowed, his once proud shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of humiliation. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. Instead, I lifted my glass once more, this time toward Edward, and offered a single word. Thank you. He gave me a small, approving nod. The guests began to stir, rising slowly, murmuring in hushed tones. Some offered me tentative nods. Others hurried to leave, eager to escape the wreckage of a night they'd never forget. The string quartet never resumed. The ice sculpture began to melt, the Dawson crest dripping away in silent rivulets of water. And I stood there, alone now at the heart of it all, feeling, for the first time in years, completely weightless. I didn't need revenge speeches or final words. Charles Dawson had destroyed himself. I had simply given him the stage. The last guests filed out beneath the crystal chandeliers, their murmurs fading into the marble corridors like distant thunder. Behind them, the once pristine Dawson crest continued to weep away, water pooling at the base of the melting sculpture. I set my empty flute on a table littered with half-eaten truffles and abandoned name cards, then slipped through a side door that opened onto the shadowed service hallway. The moment the latch clicked shut, the noise of the ballroom vanished, replaced by a hush so complete it felt sacred. I pressed one palm to the cool paneling and let the silence settle over me. For 10 years, I'd carried Charles's expectations on my shoulders like a silk mantle that somehow weighed a ton. Tonight the weight was gone, shed in front of 80 witnesses and a pair of steel handcuffs. My phone vibrated. Mother. Emily, fast asleep. She asked if you'd be looking at stars tonight. I smiled. Tell her the sky here is crowded with chandeliers, but I'll look soon. I straightened, heels clicking toward the service elevator. The attendant inside startled when he recognized me, fumbling for the button. I shook my head gently. Ground floor. Please. He rode in silence, eyes wide, as if the woman beside him were an apparition that might dissolve with the next flicker of fluorescent light. The doors parted into the hotel's staff foyer. Through a window of smoked glass, I saw reporters massing at the main entrance, camera lenses and boom mics bristling like spears. I'd expected them. I also expected that feeding the frenzy would only prolong it. Jonathan waited by a rear exit, trench coat collar turned up against the drizzle. He handed me a navy umbrella. Car's ready. You all right? All finished, I answered, and meant it. He fell into step beside me as we walked to the curb where a black town car idled. For what it's worth, that was the most surgical takedown I've ever seen. I slid into the back seat, umbrella folding like a dark wing. Surgery is meant to heal, I said, even when it looks like bloodshed. Jonathan closed the door, gave a discreet nod, and melted into the rain. The driver eased into midtown traffic. Raindrops peppered the windows, streaking the city lights into molten ribbons of gold and red. Somewhere far behind us, sirens wailed, a reminder that Charles's last act on the Dawson stage was unfolding in the back of a patrol car. I drew the divorce envelope from my clutch. The paper was still warm from his hands, as though it retained the echo of panic. I slid it away, then reached for my father's signet ring that now sat heavy on my finger. Edward's words replayed in my mind. Heart and spine. And suddenly I could hear my father's laugh, gruff and proud, as if it were riding on the rattle of rain against the roof. The car turned onto Riverside. Dark water churned beyond the balustrade. The Hudson looked almost luminous under storm clouds. I cracked the window, letting wet air rush in, sharp with autumn and gasoline and freedom. My phone buzzed again, this time a call. I answered. Isabel. Sophie's voice trembled on the line. I didn't know he. You knew enough. I cut in, softly but without mercy. A lawyer from Dawson Investments will contact you, cooperate, and the DA may show leniency. A ragged breath. I was stupid. Stupidity isn't a crime, I said, but using it as an excuse is. Good night, Ms. Caldwell. I ended the call and powered the phone off entirely. Tonight deserved its own kind of quiet. 15 minutes later, the car stopped before a limestone townhouse, inherited, untouched by Charles's grasp, standing calm under climbing ivy. I thanked the driver and walked the short path alone. Rain drummed on the umbrella. A private applause. Inside, the foyer lamp glowed low. The scent of old cedar and lavender greeted me. My mother appeared on the staircase in a robe, relief softening her stern features. We embraced without words, then she gestured toward the upstairs hall. She insisted on falling asleep with the curtains open. I climbed the steps, each one lighter than the last. Emily's door stood ajar. Moonlight spilled across the rug. And there she was, small, peaceful. One hand curled around a stuffed rabbit whose ear had known better days. I knelt beside the bed. Mommy's here, I whispered. She stirred, eyes fluttering half open. The stars? Still there, I murmured, brushing damp hair from her forehead. And shining brighter than ever. She smiled in her sleep and drifted off again. I remained a while, listening to the even rhythm of her breathing until the storm outside receded to a gentle patter. At last I rose, closed the curtains, and returned to the hall. Downstairs, I poured a single measure of my father's favorite scotch, amber, smoky, defiant. I carried it to the drawing room window and raised the glass to my own reflection, a woman no longer defined by someone else's narrative. To truth, I whispered once more, the word echoing back at me from dark panes. I drank, savoring the burn as it slid into warmth. Then I set the glass aside, switched off the lamp, and stepped into the quiet house that was mine again, ready, at last, to begin a life uncompromised by anyone's shadow but illuminated, wholly, by my own. 2 weeks later, the headlines had begun to cool. But one loose thread remained, one I couldn't ignore. Her name was Lydia Hartwell. Corporate counsel, polished, enigmatic. And, according to Jonathan's dossier, the architect behind Charles's hidden network of shell companies, she'd drafted the silent trust meant to siphon Dawson dividends into an offshore maze. Without her, Charles's scheme would never have matured past cocktail napkin bravado. Tonight, Lydia was the keynote speaker at the Gizai Women's Executive Alliance Autumn Gala. Lecturing on, of all things, ethical governance, the irony was an open dare. I arrived at the historic conservatory just as the orchestra struck its welcoming prelude. Jonathan, stationed near the coat check, gave a subtle nod. Lydia was already on stage, slides glowing behind her like stained glass. I slipped into a rear aisle seat, letting the dim light swallow me. Lydia stood in a porcelain white suit, voice smooth as lacquer. Integrity, she told the rapt audience, is the cornerstone of sustainable leadership. I almost laughed. When the applause swelled, the moderator announced a brief Q&A. I rose. My heels clicked across marble, every step a calm verdict. Ms. Hartwell, I began, projecting just enough for the microphone to catch. Would you agree that integrity also means declining to facilitate fraudulent asset transfers for a married client intent on defrauding his own corporation? A hush fell so abruptly the chandeliers seemed to vibrate. Lydia's practiced composure flickered. I'm not sure I understand the insinuation. I smiled, warm, unhurried. Allow me to clarify. I turned slightly. Jonathan stepped forward from the aisle, handing folders to 2 uniformed women flanking the stage, agents from the Manhattan DA's Financial Crimes Unit. Their badges flashed under the footlights. These documents, I continued, outline a series of trusts and shell entities you registered in Guernsey and the Caymans. Signatories, Charles Dawson and the Hartwell Legal Group. Amount transferred so far? $12.4 million. Company funds disguised as consulting fees. Gasps rippled through the hall. Lydia's lips parted, but no words emerged. The lead agent mounted the stairs. Ms. Hartwell, we have a few questions. Please accompany us. Lydia tried to gather her papers, but her hands shook, scattering note cards like confetti. The audience, CEOs, senators' wives, Ivy League deans, watched the arrest of a woman who had preached virtue 12 minutes earlier. I left the stage lights behind, moving toward the grand foyer. Reporters were already streaming in, tipped off by an anonymous press release time-stamped 30 minutes before the gala. Jonathan's doing. Outside, cool autumn air curled around the sandstone arches. Edward Ramsay waited near a fountain, moonlight glinting off his silver hair. Clean sweep, he murmured, offering a quiet nod of respect. Your father would be proud. It was unfinished business, I replied. Now the board can rebuild without parasites. He handed me a slim envelope. Auditors discovered Charles took out a key man insurance policy on you, without your knowledge. The payout clause was unsettling. We've voided it, but you should see the paperwork. I slipped the envelope into my clutch, pulse steady, even behind bars. Charles managed new offenses, but each discovery only sharpened my resolve. A car door thudded nearby, Lydia being guided into the back of a cruiser. Flashbulbs popped. I didn't stay to watch. As I descended the conservatory steps, a drizzle began, soft needles of silver knitting the night sky. I opened my umbrella, inhaling petrichor and the faint scent of triumph. Somewhere a string quartet resumed, its music drifting through open windows, notes both wistful and resolute. Tomorrow would bring statements, court dates, depositions. Yet tonight, a final piece had clicked into place. Justice, I realized, isn't always a gavel slammed in a marble courtroom. Sometimes it's a single question asked under crystal chandeliers, exposing the rot behind a flawless facade. I turned toward the waiting town car. My reflection in the rain-slicked door was clear-eyed, unburdened. The hunter's snare was empty now, every accomplice caught in their own, and I, finally, was free to walk away. Morning sunlight slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dawson Tower, gilding the boardroom in quiet gold. Outside, Manhattan's skyline stretched clear and bright, untroubled by the storms that had raged only weeks earlier. I stood at the head of the mahogany conference table where my father once presided. 12 directors, some longtime allies, some newly appointed after emergency votes, waited in attentive silence. Their gazes held deference, curiosity, a trace of awe. A year ago, I would have felt a flicker of imposter's panic. Today, the air tasted different, brisk, bracing, undeniably mine. "Thank you for convening so early," I began. My voice, to my own ears, sounded tempered steel. Dawson Investments survived a breach of trust because our foundation was stronger than one man's ambition. Now we rebuild, wiser, leaner, and absolutely transparent. I slid a binder across the polished surface. Inside lay the first initiative, a whistleblower program insulated from executive interference, audited quarterly by an independent firm. Next, a revised code of ethics bearing my signature and the board's unanimous endorsement. Finally, a commitment to reinvest 10% of annual profits into mentorship programs for underrepresented founders, an idea my father once sketched on a napkin but never lived to implement. Edward Ramsey smiled down the table. "Your father's legacy evolves," he said softly. Heads nodded, pens scratched approvals, a collective exhale followed. The meeting adjourned without dissent. By 10 o'clock, I was alone in the executive suite, a space Charles had coveted yet never truly earned. I traced a fingertip along the window glass, feeling both the chill of November and the electric promise of beginning again. Beneath the skyline, taxis swarmed like gold beetles and steam curled from subway gratings, an urban pulse in perfect cadence with my own heartbeat. Behind me, a small voice cleared her throat. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching a lunchbox and a sketchbook adorned with constellations. My mother hovered just beyond, ready to escort her to school. Emily's eyes widened at the sprawling view. "You can see everything from here," she whispered. "Not everything," I corrected gently, kneeling to her height. "But enough to know where you're going." She opened the sketchbook, revealing a crayon drawing. 2 figures on a rooftop, hand in hand beneath a sky streaked with comets. One wore a crown, the other held a telescope. "I made this for you, Mommy," she said. "So you remember to look up when things get hard." My throat tightened. I hugged her, inhaling the faint scent of paper and peach shampoo. "I'll keep it on my desk forever." After they left, I placed the drawing in a silver frame beside my father's photograph, a quiet dialogue between past and future. Then I pulled out a sheet of Dawson blue stationery and began a letter. Emily. One day you'll ask why I fought so hard, why I turned a ballroom into a courtroom and truth into our shield. The answer is simple. Dignity is the only inheritance that can't be stolen. Guard it, share it. Let no one convince you it's negotiable. I signed, sealed, and tucked the envelope into a locked drawer marked, for Emily, her 21st birthday. Some lessons ripen with time. The rest of the week unfolded in purposeful rhythm. A settlement hearing where Charles, gaunt and resentful, relinquished every false claim. A press conference where I spoke precisely 23 words, enough to affirm stability, too few to feed gossip. An evening at the townhouse painting, stars on Emily's ceiling until our necks ached and our laughter filled the corridors. Friday brought a soft rain and one final appointment, returning the gilded ballroom key to the Crown Atherton. I walked the familiar corridor, nodding to staff who now regarded me with discreet admiration rather than pity. The ballroom stood empty, hushed but not haunted. Workers polished crystal sconces for the next gala, unaware of the ghosts we had banished. At the center of the parquet floor, I paused. The space that once echoed with Charles's venom now held only the faint scent of lemon oil and possibility. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and let the silence confirm what the noise never could. The story had reached its cadence. Full stop. Outside, dusk settled like indigo silk over the city. Taxi headlights streaked wet pavement. Somewhere a saxophone threaded blue notes into the night air. I raised my umbrella, stepped off the curb, and, without looking back, crossed the avenue toward whatever waited on the far side of freedom. Because revenge, I had learned, isn't only about destroying the cage, it is about discovering how wide your wings can spread once the door swings open.